千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As always, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. The Chinese title for this chapter is Drawing Bow. Drawing here means pulling back on the bowstring in order to shoot an arrow. And sometimes an alternative term is to expand the bow to describe the same action. So either way, it's about pulling back to fire off an arrow. As we have talked about and discussed last time, this chapter is using that action, firing off the arrow, as an analogy to describe what we do in life. And this is by extension of comparing this action to how the heavenly Tao works. So to bring everybody's attention back to the chapter itself, here's what we looked at and examined previously. So we divided up this chapter into multiple sections, and the end result of that analysis looks like this. It's basically 3 major sections, but the middle section is subdivided into 2 subsections of 3 lines each. The first section is talking about the Tao of heaven, comparing that to drawing the bow, getting ready to fire. Then it talks about adjusting the aim, whether you raise the bow higher or lower, depending on what you're trying to hit, how far away that target is. And that is metaphoric about the way we do things in life. More on that in the next slide. In the second section, it talks about more specifically how the Tao of heaven works. And it talks about how the Tao of heaven is reducing the excessive and adding to the lacking or the insufficient. So in other words, the Tao of heaven will even things out in the long run. Now, the Tao of people, as you can see here, starting from line 10, is not quite like that. Even though we're connected to the Tao of heaven, oftentimes human beings can act in ways that are contrary to the heavenly Tao. And this is about us reducing what is already insufficient. You know, people who are in debt are the ones who may spend even more. And then people add to the excessive, take away from what is lacking, offer to the excessive. So think of this as the opposite of legendary tales of Robin Hood. Robin Hood was sent to rob the rich, give to the poor. That's the story of his adventures. But he was legendary precisely because so often in life we see the exact opposite. That is, the poor get robbed in order to offer what they have to the rich. And there's going to be more examples about that coming up. And the third section that you see there is the conclusion. And it's talking about what the sages do. So when you take a step back and look at the overview of chapter 77, it starts out talking about the Tao of heaven, then it zooms in to talk about the Tao of people being contrary to the Tao of heaven. Then it goes to the Tao of sages. The Tao of the sages is an emulation of the Tao of heaven to be different from the Tao of many people out there. So we will get into all of that in great detail. So moving on, I want to offer a quick recap of what we have already talked about. This chapter starts out with a clear statement of the metaphor involved. It says that the heavenly Tao, or the Tao of heaven, is just like archery. And in the bullet points, I say that it's macro to micro. What I mean by that is that the Tao itself is the principle of the universe. The Tao is universal, and that's why I say it is the macrocosmic level. It applies everywhere to everything. Archery, on the other hand, is a human level activity. So far as we know, Earth is the only world in which archery takes place, to the best of our knowledge. So it's happening at the human level on this planet instead of universal. So that's the reason why I say it is the micro personal level. But the heavenly Tao, the macro, applies to the micro because the Tao is everywhere and applies to everything. So human activities are no exception to that. It also means when we learn the Tao properly, we get insights into human activities, not just archery, but everything else that we do. And conversely, by looking at the process of archery, we gain insights into the greater Tao as well. And that's because the two are connected. From the macrocosmic to the personal micro level, and back from our level to the level of the universal Tao. So then the techniques of archery map to the actions in life, actions we take in life. So pulling back on the bowstring to draw the bow is the same as saying you are accumulating the energy or the motivation to do something. And I compare it to crouching down in order to make a jump. You are accumulating energy, you're getting ready to do something. To let the arrow go, to release the arrow, fire it off, is to make the attempt. And then the success of a project is indicated by whether or not you hit the target. If it is bullseye, right in the center of the target, the project is successful. If it's off-center, then you have accomplished your objective, but perhaps not in the best possible way. If you miss the target completely, the arrow flies off somewhere and then buries itself into the ground, then that project did not succeed. So this is the clear metaphor that Lao Tzu was referring to at the beginning of this chapter. Then we make that much more explicit with this particular graphic. It just shows what happens in archery. You have to angle it just right. You can't shoot in a straight line at the target because of gravity. You always have to angle it just a little bit so that when you fire it off, it makes that curve and it strikes the target. And this means if the angle is too high, the arrow is gonna shoot right past. You miss the target. If the angle is too low, it hits the ground before the target. So that is why there's overshooting, there's undershooting, And then there's on target. So the adjustment is the key. It just means that in life, we have to adjust what we do with the right angle. And then the other factor is the amount of strength. In archery, we also know that the angle may be correct, but if you pull back too much, the curve is not quite right, you may still be shooting off center or you can miss. If the strength is too little, the angle may be perfect, but there's not enough power to drive the arrow over that long distance to the target, so it ends up on the ground before the target. So the amount of strength has to be moderated as well. The angle has to be adjusted to just the right angle, and the amount of power that you put into it also has to be adjusted, has to be moderated to just the right amount of strength. So putting all that together, we can then go into what that means in everyday life situations. This is just mapping archery to life actions. We're not necessarily archers. Archery nowadays is a relatively rare hobby. Only a few people get into it, but we know how the process looks, so we can map archery to life. Hitting the target is achieving a goal, and keep in mind that this can be any goal. It could be a physical goal, like fitness goal, as an example. You want to perhaps develop strength or agility or flexibility, etc. It can be a mental goal, like learning something new. It can be a spiritual goal, like Tao cultivation. The goal can be in the material world, like making a certain amount of money, attaining a promotion, having some sort of material world success. And this is where I talked about last time that from the Tao perspective, these are goals like any other. There's no distinction about certain goals like, trying to make a living as unworthy compared to attaining a higher level of spirituality. There's no distinction between them. They're all goals. They are all worthwhile for individual pursuit, depending on one's situation and one's inclination in life. Of course, it is entirely possible to be pursuing material wealth when one already has much more than one can possibly spend in a lifetime. And that's where we're going to get to the Tao of people later on, adding to that which is already excessive, already sufficient. Then we talked about how drawing back the bowstring is to gather the energy, getting motivated. And in a project, it's also about planning the steps, planning the actions, preparing the resources, coordinating among people. So what about aiming too high? Lao Tzu says, if your aim is too high, you have to lower your aim. This is metaphoric language to describe what happens when you are aiming too high, as in achieving a goal that is not realistic. You overestimate your abilities. This is a little bit different than when we talk about how, aim for the stars, land on a mountaintop. That's basically an intentional overachieving in order to still end up with a pretty good result. So that's a different idea. Here, Lao Tzu is just talking about how sometimes you can miss your target entirely because you are trying to do something that you did not have the ability to do. And then aiming too low is the opposite. That means, like the arrow falling short of the target, your effort is falling short of your objective. You're underestimating yourself. You're not putting in the amount of effort that you are capable of. It's like pulling back the bowstring in a half-hearted way, and then not really pulling back as much as you need to, but just pulling it back a little bit and then letting it go. Of course, the arrow is going to fall somewhere in front of you, well short of the target. That is metaphoric language for not really doing your best, not really fulfilling your potential. And it's something that you may regret later on, like, oh man, I could have done more. I could have accomplished my objective if I just put in a little more effort into it. And then pulling back too much, firing it off with too much power, too much force, is the overkill scenario. It's the striving and struggling. The mighty striving, trying so hard, trying too hard, pushing yourself too much, and perhaps causing yourself some harm or injury in the process. Overtraining is a good example of that. While pulling back too little, the half-hearted effort, holding yourself back, not really doing what you can. So we've covered pretty much everything from psyching yourself up in the beginning of an endeavor, taking a deep breath before getting into it, sort of like the runner waiting for the starting pistol before sprinting off. We've talked about unrealistic expectations, maybe even impossible expectations. We've talked about how it is possible to fire off the arrow into the ground, and we can see all of this together is an elegant metaphor. In one image, we see all the different aspects that go into what we do in life repeatedly. So this is the main metaphor and how it maps to life. Let's continue on. This is the last of the recap slides, and now we're going to go into new territory to talk about the lines that we haven't talked about last time. We're now on line 7, and this is describing the heavenly Tao. So first, Lao Tzu describes the Tao of heaven as a balancing mechanism, and I use this graphic here to represent that. Now, the heaven or the sky covers the world. So traditionally, when Tao sages talk about the heavenly Tao, they are referring to everything, everywhere, large and small, seen and unseen, just absolutely everything. So what we can say is that the universal balance is affecting everything, everywhere. In other words, the balancing effect of the Tao manifests in every level of existence. We can see it all around us if we look through the eyes of the Tao. Just like the ancient sages, when they looked to the sky, they observed weather. They saw that there's a balancing of nature when you look to the heaven. The ancient sages looked around in nature, all around them, and over time, they observed changes that occur throughout the year. Cyclical changes. And then the sages looked around at their fellow human beings. They observed human society, and they observed the balancing effects of karma, another kind of balance. Not like exactly the balancing of the weather, but related because they're all part of the Tao. So let's get into the details of what they have observed since ancient times. Line 8 says reduces the excessive. Line 9 says and adds to the lacking. Now, excessive and lacking I must note it's all from our perspective, that is, the human perspective. Excessive in terms of heat or cold from the human perspective, what we're used to, because it is the only perspective open to us. And from what we can see, because we live in this world, the heavenly Tao balances everything to reach equilibrium, which is the comfortable level for us, the moderate temperature, in order for us to exist, to survive, to live. And this, as you can see in the graphic that I have here, the 4 seasons, this can be readily seen in the seasonal changes. It is the characteristic of the heavenly Tao to decrease whatever is too much, like too much heat in the summer, and that gets decreased when autumn comes around. That is, the heat starts to cool off. Conversely, when it's excessively cold in wintertime, well, we know it's going to transition into spring when things start warming up. So nature has that effect to balance things out, to make it more even, more comfortable for us, more survivable for human beings. And not just us, but all living things. The overall effect is that the myriad of things, plants, animals, ourselves included, can all survive and thrive under these conditions, and at least have the ability to adapt to them. So it can be pretty cold, but not so cold that we cannot adapt ourselves in order to get through winter. Conversely, it can be really hot, but not so hot that we cannot adapt ourselves to find shade, to cool off with some water, etc. So the heavenly Tao governs all and balances all. From summer to autumn, excessive heat cools down. From winter to spring, excessive cold warms up. Extreme temperatures will always be moderated. That's the bottom line. Now that's worldwide. That's seasonal changes affect the entire world. We want to then zoom in on the personal level to look at what happens in our day-to-day lives. Excessive heat gradually cools off. Here you can see something that is hot, maybe tea, maybe coffee, initially piping hot, gradually cools down. And then you see the ice cube melting. So excessive cold gradually warms up, which means the ice becomes water. Now, the same is true out in nature as well. When there's overpopulation of prey animals, predators will bring about ecological balance by thinning the herd. So we have seen that to be true in the animal world, in the animal kingdom. And it's the same for plants. When there is excessive growth, nature has balancing mechanisms. Lightning may strike a tree, causing a forest fire, and that will reduce the excessive growth, achieving some sort of balance. Now, among human beings, we talked about hot and cold things reaching a more even temperature. We talked about the animal world. We talked about plants. Human beings, we have seen how someone who is very proud, excessive in terms of arrogance and hubris, they get cut down to size. That is, the arrogance leads them to doing something foolish, which achieves a bad effect, and then they have to rethink their arrogance. They're cut down to size, achieving more of a balance. We have also seen among human beings that when some people are excessively aggressive or violent, that their aggression and violence will cause them to do things that bring about the same kind of force upon themselves. They crash and burn as a result of their aggressive tendencies or violent tendencies. Then they have to rethink their violent ways, thus achieving more of a balance. So the last two there is what I was talking about when I said that the ancient sages observed human society and they noticed the balancing mechanism, what we today will call karma. But 2,500 years ago, the term karma did not exist. They just knew back in those days that human beings, actions, reactions occur in cycles. And cause and effect were what they called the heavenly net that one could not escape. Now, among human beings, we can take a look at all this, and then we can also learn just from the observations like the ancient sages have done. We can, for instance, notice that, when we look at the hot drinks cooling down, ice cube melting, etc., we can take a cue from that. When we're noticing someone who is lacking warmth, we can be warmer toward that person. When someone is in need of greater understanding, that understanding is lacking for that person, we can be the one to bring about that understanding. So when we notice in general, when we notice that there's anything lacking among the people around us, we can play a role. We can be like the Tao. We can play the part of the balancing mechanism to be a part of that heavenly Tao. So let's return to that topic. But now we have to talk about the fact that the Tao of people is completely unlike the Tao of heaven. Oftentimes, we do things that are the opposite of the balancing mechanism we have just talked about. So line 10 says, the Tao of people is not so, not like the heavenly Tao. Despite our connection to the Tao, we're not always aligned with the Tao. We know that to be true because we see people fail all the time, and they may not realize that their actions are not Tao-like, thus leading to failure. We see people who are miserable because they don't understand the Tao or how to apply the Tao. And their actions, they are not aware that their actions are actually going against the Tao. And it's the same for so many other people. What we can do, what we often do, can often be contrary to the Tao. In general, the more we immerse ourselves in the material world, the further we take ourselves away from the Tao. The material world, material pursuits, the excessive pursuit of material gains has a diluting effect on us in terms of connection to the Tao. Which means the Tao reduces the excessive, we reduce the already insufficient. The Tao adds to the insufficient, we add to the excessive. We have all seen examples among people that when someone is already wrong about something, that they double down, that they want to insist even more about their erroneous perspective. We have seen how when someone is already suffering from a problem of addiction, they become even more addicted. They add to the problem. They do not get themselves out of that problem. So that is the Tao of people. That is what people often do to drive themselves further and further away from the Tao. Now, I would like to focus on that and bring about further examples to illustrate it, starting with ancient times. We're talking about these two lines, lines 11 and 12. The Tao people reduces the lacking in order to offer to the excessive. So why would Lao Tzu say that? Why would Lao Tzu write these lines based on his experience and his observation from 2,500 years ago? Well, you see, in ancient times, it was royalty and nobility who had excess. By excess, I mean excess wealth, excess in terms of luxuries, things that ordinary people in ancient times could only dream about. They were the peasants and commoners. They toiled in poverty. And throughout history, not just in ancient China, but much of the world, this was oftentimes the case. Ancient people, regardless of whereabouts in the world, did not have a great life. Poverty was often the rule rather than the exception. So it made things worse when tyrannical rulers, in a tyranny, the ruler would tax the people even more. The people were already suffering, but what little they still had would be taken away by force. This meant that Lao Tzu observed that tendency, rather than to balance the extremes, the tyrant made the situation even more extreme. The collected taxes, of course, were added to the excess wealth, excess luxuries that was enjoyed by the ruling elite. That was almost the standard back in the days when tyrannical rule was frequent and not really a cause for surprise. So moving on, what about today rather than ancient times? Well, it is rather sad, but human nature hasn't really changed that much. It is still the same today. We say the rich get richer while the poor get poorer. And that is because from our observation, we can see how the rich get richer and become the center of attention. In the meantime, the poor get poorer and they are invariably neglected and dismissed. Just by us pointing this out, we can readily think of many examples in our society. Now, we have one of the most affluent societies in the world today and in terms of history, but still, we see this. We see the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We see the rich become the center of attention and the poor become neglected and dismissed. This is the Tao of people in action. The powerful are in the best position to increase the power. We have seen this to be the case. Powerful in terms of any walk of life. It could be a powerful executive at a company, at a corporation. They are in the best position to increase their power. The powerful could be a politician who is in a higher position in government. That politician will be in the best position to further increase his or her power. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the powerless. The powerless are exploited and silenced. We often see that as well. Now, there are many other ways that we can see this effect. In general, there's the bandwagon effect in life. People jump on the bandwagon. If there's something that is popular, more and more people jump on it, jump on the bandwagon. You see this all the time in sports. Regardless of the exact type of sports, the winning team is getting more and more support from every direction. And so in general, those who have a lot more get more of what they do not need. And conversely, the weak, well, when they're down, people pile on. And we'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Those who are already not doing well, have a lot of debt, they get even more debt on top of the debt they already had. Those who are unhealthy, they become even more unhealthy. We've seen this to be the case for many people. So those without the ability to speak up for themselves, they really get the shaft in our world. They get the short end of the stick, and that just means they get even less of an ability to get out of their predicament. The downtrodden are often mocked, despised. If you are poor, you must live in an area that is not as safe as what we call a good area. You suffer from the danger or the potential to be robbed, to be mugged. Unpopular people, we have seen this in school. An unpopular child will be the subject of even more bullying. In society, we notice how the uninformed become ever more ignorant. They seek out sources of misinformation so that their view of reality becomes even more divorced from actual reality itself. So this is the opposite. Those who already have less tend to lose even more. So let's take a look at comparisons between heaven and people. That is, the Tao of heaven, as expressed in these lines, reduces the excessive, adds to the lacking. This is, as we mentioned, this is like the weather. Never too much of anything. When it is too dry, you know it's going to rain sooner or later. The drought cannot last forever. While you're going through it, it seems like it may last forever. Everybody complains about it. But from experience, we already know that it's not going to last forever. At some point, it's going to start raining. The reverse is also true when there's too much rain, as much of the country has experienced. The rain, will eventually stop. It cannot continue raining forever. We know that to be a fact. Conversely, we can say, if it's not enough water, it'll rain. If it's not enough sunny weather, the rain will stop. So these are two different ways to talk about reducing the excessive as to the lacking. Then let's take a look at what human beings do, the Tao of people. The Tao of people, Lao Tzu says, is the opposite, reducing the lacking to offer to the excessive. Notice how we pile on because too much is never enough. The weather is never too much of anything. For human beings, too much is never enough. This applies to praise, but also applies to condemnation. What do I mean by that? Well, as I pointed out, in society, we often see those who become well-known or recognized for achievements. This can be, as I mentioned, a powerful and famous politician, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be a famous scientist, entertainer, musician, artist, poet, athlete. The list goes on and on. As such people receive widespread praise, they get even more praise. We have definitely seen that to be the case. And notice I say that people pile on in the other direction too, in the direction of condemnation. We have seen how some people become widely condemned, like criminals, scammers, and so on. And perhaps initially, no one says much, but some people break the silence and start criticizing or condemning such people. Suddenly, it's like the dam has broken. More and more voices join in. more and more people join in to kick them when they're down. So the human perception seems to be more must be better, that it's never enough. What we have to do instead is to pay attention and learn from the Tao of heaven. When people, just as an example, people at the office may be trying to outdo one another in praising the boss, in appealing to the boss. In a situation like that, the Tao cultivator will focus on work instead. Let actions speak for him or her. And as I previously mentioned, Tao cultivators also, we must pay attention to what may be lacking or needed in other people. One person may need understanding, another may need encouragement, yet another may need guidance or helping him or a nudge in the right direction. The Tao cultivator is ready to add to that which is not enough. So this is just a quick comparison between the two. And the last part of it, what the Tao cultivators do, that belongs to following the Tao of the sages, which is in emulation of the Tao of heaven. So what I would like to do now, I see that we're approaching the midpoint of our meeting today. I would like to pause on this slide. We'll park the presentation here as we take a 5-minute break. We're now on line 13. Line 13 says, who can offer their access to the world? I want to break down this line to show you guys how the translation is arrived at. So this is a fairly long line. It's got 8 characters in it. The very first character is who, and this is the ancient usage of the character. This is no longer used in modern Mandarin. And then the second character, used in ancient times as well as today, a very common character, it is the character for can, as in can do something or able to do something. The third character is also very common nowadays, oftentimes used in everyday speech, and that's have. So far, we've got who can have. Then the fourth character is the character for excess. Excess meaning leftovers, it means abundance, more than you need. So when you have a Chinese New Year celebration, oftentimes you see this character, the fourth character, and that is because it's a good thing to have more than you need. It means you enjoy prosperity or abundance. That is the first 4 characters there. Who can have access? Who can have access in order to, which means more than they can possibly use. And then the second set of 4 characters go together, and it is talking about it. There's the 5th character there, and then offer, the 6th character. The last 2 characters go together. 天下. That's a very common expression in ancient times as well as today. It just means below heaven, literally sky and then below. It just means the world, because as I mentioned, the heaven is the cover for the entire world. Putting all of it together, you see the translation. If it's a very literal translation, it would be a transcription like who can, having access, offer it, the access, into the to the world. Then, by rearranging the words a little bit to make it more like spoken or written English, make it flow better, you see the translation up there, who can offer their access to the world. It's another way to say, who are the ones that can, because they have access, offer that access to the world, which will be a longer way to talk about the same thing. Now, I want to point out that it is very common In our world, for you, for me, for everybody else, when people don't have enough, they accumulate more in a natural way. What I mean is we all have to make a living. We all start out working to accumulate financial resources. This is natural. This is to be expected for humanity, for everybody. After a while, though, it becomes more of a habitual pattern. More work, more accumulation. It can happen that we may be stuck in the cycle of accumulation. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about how sometimes people are accumulating for the sake of accumulation, that they already have what they need. They have more than they need, or they have many times more than they can possibly use. Their original purpose was perhaps to establish financial independence, and they've had that many times over. Perhaps the original purpose was to raise a family, and now the children have all grown. That original purpose is set to one side. The purpose becomes to accumulate even more just because. So like I said, a common scenario, something that we see in society all the time. Even when people have enough, they keep on accumulating. Whereas from the Tao perspective, the sage would say, share that which is already excessive. Give people more of what you already have enough of. It doesn't have to be material things either. It could be that the excess you have could be manifesting in terms of talent, in terms of what you can do. Then the idea is to share your gift with the world. Those who cannot, those who grab onto what they have and won't let go, it is oftentimes driven by fear, insecurity, and attachment. How does that work? Well, when you have gone through periods of not enough, financially insecure, that can result in fear. And that could manifest as a continuing fear that you will go back to the state where you are lacking resources. That fear, that insecurity drives you to get even more, well beyond the point of sufficiency. You are attached to your possessions and you want more of it. That can completely happen. So the Tao is pointing this out in order to get us to think about being the exception. Who can be different and emulate the Tao instead of people? That is the meaning of line 13. Line 13 says, who can offer their access to the world? This is Lao Tzu saying, who can be the ones who understand the heavenly Tao and therefore act in a similar way as the balancing mechanism of the heavenly Tao. And that's why line 14 says, only those who have the Tao. We'll get to that in just a minute. So in order for us to be different, to emulate the Tao instead of people, we start out by recognizing the pattern, the pre-existing pattern in our world today. And we just have to look around to notice how bad the hoarding behavior can get. We have people who live with so much clutter that it gets in the way of them going from one place in the house to another. They have to navigate through all the clutter that they have because of the hoarding. Extreme hoarders. Now, hopefully we're not anywhere near that badly, that indisposed in terms of living life in accordance with the Tao. At the same time, we can all resolve to live simply, to discard excess. The more we do that, the better off we're going to be. The key realization is that most of our possessions very invariably become trash. Most of it becomes trash when we pass away. Happens to everybody. So the better way is to share, to contribute, to be charitable. It is still the exception today, the people who give rather than the people who take. And as I pointed out, it doesn't have to be material things. It can be giving attention, giving your energy, your mental, spiritual resources to be shared with other people. Now, let's continue on to talk about what Lao Tzu says about only those who have the Tao. The 4 characters I would like to break down as well. The first character means only. And the second character, similar. It's a repeat character. You can see the same character as the third character in line 13. Same meaning, have. The third character should be a familiar character. That is the character for the Tao. The last character is he who, she who, those who, they who. It can play different roles depending on what you're saying precisely. And this syntactically is very different from English. When translating, you always have to reverse the order and put this in front. So you can say only those who have the Tao, and that is indeed the way it is translated. Only those who have the Tao are the ones who can offer their access to the world. Let me be very specific as to what having the Tao means. It means, first, having the opportunity to study the Tao. Because we're all together in this meeting, number 1 covers all of us. We can check item 1. Number 2, having the capacity to understand the Tao. I believe this to be most of us. We're discussing it, we're talking about it, we're learning it. We, hopefully all of us, have the capacity to understand the Tao. I think we can check this one as well. Number 3, having the wisdom to apply the Tao. This one is tougher. The challenge is to check all 3, including item number 3. Now, it's my job to explain the Tao plainly, basically. Hopefully, you find it easy to understand. You can check number 2. The third one, well, not everybody who understands the Tao will apply the Tao. And just applying the Tao one time is not sufficient. One has to apply the Tao consistently going forward. If we have all 3, it means we're able to let go. We're able to share the abundance that we enjoy. And that's the key, really. The ability to let go, the willingness to let go. When we have more than what we need, we share it. And that's what we're doing now. We're sharing the Tao with one another. So the excess that we've been talking about, the character that you see in the middle of line 13, the 4th character, excess is the key. What I mean is, we oftentimes talk about how someone is very kind and charitable. He would give the shirt off his back to a person in need. And I will be the person to say, that's actually not the Tao. Excess is the key. The person who has many layers of clothing, way more than he needs, that should be the person to Share. Not the person who only has one shirt on to take it off and give it to someone else means that this person is now in need of a shirt. Basically, the Tao is not about giving your last penny to the poor. When you give your last penny to the poor, you no longer have any pennies. So the Tao of giving means specific things. It may be counterintuitive, but as I said, the Tao is not about giving the shirt off your back. It's about balance. So the Tao of giving, number one, talked about in this particular chapter towards the end, is to give without needing to claim credit. In fact, giving anonymously is not a bad idea. It's assuming the low profile. Now, if the act of giving is noticed by others, that's okay too. But the point is, there's no specific attempt to make it seen, make it obvious, advertise the fact. So give without needing to claim credit. Give with no strings attached, no conditions. So it used to be that when I gave, I was always thinking, well, if I were to give to this poor person, will this person be using what I give to him in ways that I do not approve? Will this person just be using the money to get drugs or alcohol or cigarettes, things that I disapprove? Well, those are the conditions that I placed in my mind. Those were the strings attached. I have learned since studying the Tao to hold on to the charitable impulse, the initial impulse to give, that is pure, that is without conditions or strings attached. What other people do is up to them. If I want to give, I should simply give without those preconditions. That's the pure expression of compassion, untainted by the strings. That's number two. Number three, give accordance with your ability to give. That's what I meant by the counterintuitive part. It's not necessarily wise to share when you don't have enough in the first place. You should be focusing on getting enough to establish yourself so you can be in a position to give. Basically, you want to give without damaging your ability to continue giving. This goes back to a very specific idea that runs throughout Chinese history and culture called the small stream. Basically, the expression 4 characters literally translates to thin water, long flow. Thin water is the small stream. Long flow, it just means that a small stream continues flowing for a long time, perhaps indefinitely. Conversely, the opposite to the small stream is a big splash, like a torrent, a big wave, something that, like a flood, comes and goes. It happens and then it's done. Whether it's a torrent or flooding, they happen for a while and that's it, no more. If it's giving everything you have to someone, that is like a big splash. It's transient, it doesn't last. You want the opposite. You want to give what you can, a small stream, but then you want to continue consistently give. Why is this in accordance with the Tao? Well, it's because the Tao is that which lasts. The nature of the Tao is eternal. Whatever is in accordance with the Tao is lasting. Whatever is not in accordance with the Tao is transient. So we talk about, for instance, that violence is opposite to the Tao. Violence is explosive. It happens, it's done, someone is hurt. Friendship goes on. Friendship goes the distance. Friendship is in accordance with the Tao because it lasts. That which goes with the Tao is lasting. And when we apply this to life, we can apply it in a whole bunch of different ways. It's continuous, modest giving when it applies to giving. And the basic idea, I think, is pretty simple, easy to grasp. If you give too much at once, it's like the flood that comes and goes. It's like the material world. Remember, the material world is impermanent. The term from Buddhism is that it's transient or impermanent. Everything keeps changing. Nothing lasts. It's like the flame on a candle that comes and goes. It simply isn't real in terms of not having a lasting existence. So when we apply this idea, the small stream flows for a long time, we can apply it to work. In work, it simply means we want to economize resources to avoid running short. Plan on a long-term basis. You don't want to be just here and gone. You want to continue for the long term. You're in it for the long haul, is what we usually say. When this is applied to friendship, it just means that true friends are the ones that you hang on to all your life. They go the distance with you. Those are true friends. False friends are full of sweet flattery, extravagant gestures. Those don't last. They are probably after something in that they have an agenda. Therefore, they become your quote unquote friends for the time being. But when they have what they want, they're gone. They're not true friends. What about relationships like family, like marriage, like romance? Well, we know that fire burns hot and then it burns out. So in that, as it is in a false friendship, extravagance won't last. Passion is great in the beginning, but after a while, we know from observing life that true love settles into a long-term relationship where it is just as important, just as significant to spend quiet time together. Just as important, just as significant as passion was in the beginning. And lastly, in Tao cultivation, the same idea applies. Tao cultivation is not becoming a fanatical, zealous person devoted to the Tao all of a sudden. That won't last. Tao cultivation, well, the way to walk the path is to keep a low key, slow and steady. Practice Tao in daily increments, one step at a time, a little bit of wisdom gained at a time, and extending that over a longer period of time. That is real Tao cultivation. It is in congruence with the Tao because it is the small stream that flows for a long time. Continuing on to line 15. Therefore, sages act without conceit. Let's talk about that. Sages apply the Tao simply because it is the best way to live. I want to point out that this is not necessarily religious in nature. They don't apply the Tao because it is their religion. It's a rational, logical choice based on what the sages have already seen from life, from nature, from everybody around them. They figure out that there is a better path called the Tao that is simply the best way to live. When you see that with clarity, why wouldn't you want to walk the path? it is the best way. Sages follow nature. They see nature has this overriding, overall balancing mechanism behind everything. So they want to follow nature. They themselves want to act as a balancing mechanism for others. If someone is lacking care and attention, they will give that person what they're lacking, the care and attention that they really lack and really need. Sages also tend to be minimalist because what they have that is more than enough, they will share. They find joy in the simple things in life. The more they share, the more they gain. The more they give of the tangible things in life, the more they enjoy from the intangible qualities like connections with people. The sages practice giving. If it is not resources that are material in nature, it can be wisdom. And oftentimes, for a sage, that's why they are in demand. Their wisdom is required by those who lack wisdom. So there's an insufficiency of wisdom. They come to the sage for that. They and the sages, in turn, share the wisdom they possess to all that come to them. Now, this is entirely natural for them. This is, oh yeah, this is as a matter of course. Of course I should do that. I should do that for myself, the sage would say, and for the people all around us. They give that goodness without inflating their ego because they're only following nature. And consider how so many of us fail at the above. We are not necessarily all minimalist or sharing what we can. We are not necessarily paying attention to other people to try to perceive what they're lacking and what they really need. Now, continuing on with the behavior of the sages, a river can be a good metaphor for the sage. We just got done talking about a small stream. It works the same way. It could be a river or a small stream. This flowing water flowing across the land, whether it's a river or stream, it nourishes all living things. And then it continues flowing, it moves on. It doesn't stick around to claim credit. It doesn't stick around to boast or to highlight itself. The sages emulate this. It means they don't pass judgment on who should or should not benefit from the Tao. If it is the river that flows, the river doesn't care who is taking from its water. It doesn't say that some animals are fitting to drink from the river while others aren't. It doesn't say beautiful flowers should be nourished by the water from the river and weeds cannot. It passes no judgment, and the sages pass no judgment. The Tao is to be shared with all. The sages make no attempt to create a karmic debt. Oftentimes, we see this happening when people want to give but want to make it known, or they want to give to a specific person and want to make sure that person knows, and they're expecting some sort of a repayment, some sort of a favor in return. This is like when we talk about, I'm calling in the favors that I did to so-and-so person before. I'm collecting the chits. I am putting an obligation on a certain person. I've done favors for him in the past. Now I expect him to do favors back to me. That's the kind of debt that I'm talking about. The sages will never attempt to do that. Now, there are some subtleties here. I would caution everyone, like even when you contribute to a charitable cause, maybe sponsoring a specific person and you communicate with that person, that is also a very specific karmic debt. My preference is to give to the organization overall. and let someone else determine who needs that contribution more. Number 3, the sages have no contrivance to be seen doing something good. Some people will make it very obvious and contrive to be seen, contrive to be known as the benefactor. The sages wouldn't bother doing that. If they're noticed doing it, that's fine. If they're not, that's fine too. Like the river, the sages can give without claiming credit, and we should be more like the sages. We too, we don't want to stick around to flaunt or boast about the giving that we have done. We don't want to try to figure out who is deserving and who is not deserving. We want to be like the river. We want to be like the rain that waters all plants, or like the sun that warms all living things. And as far as karmic debt, in Buddhist teachings, a karmic debt is something that must be repaid and collected. It can create a situation where someone is done with mortal existence, but must come back to the mortal realm in order to receive the repayment. Moving on to the last line, which is line 17. Line 17 has a character that I want to point out, and this is the character that is the 4th character, the second from last character there. Usually, when you learn Mandarin, this is a rather common character. It means to see, to watch. It's pronounced jian. I know it looks like it should be like jian, but it's jian, more like an E sound, not like an A sound. Here, in this line, it has a different pronunciation and also a different meaning. In this ancient context, is xian, not jian. It doesn't mean to see, it means to be seen. It means to show or to display. That is the context of this ancient usage, and now it makes sense why the translation is they do not wish to display their virtue. That's the sages. It's not saying they do not wish to see their virtue. That's not the correct translation. So those who, and that's because those who wish to be seen as virtuous have no real virtue. And those who possess real virtue, true virtue, are not mindful of being virtuous. It doesn't matter to them whether they're seen or not. And that is why the sages are virtuous in a natural way. Now, this is the last line of Tao Te Ching 77. We do have more to talk about in terms of application of the Tao to life. I want to bring to your attention the Goldilocks principle, or the Goldilocks effect. This is coming from the fairy tale, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And I think most of us are already familiar with that. Little girl Goldilocks goes into the house of the Three Bears. So this is the original breaking and entering, home robbery scenario. Little girl sees 3 bowls of porridge. One of them is too hot. Another one is too cold, and the third one is just right, just the right temperature. Then she sat in the chair, and then she tried the beds. One bed is too hard, another bed is too soft, the third bed is just right. So she fell asleep. Now, the main point is the just right part. How is that related to this chapter? Well, remember the example of archery. Lao Tzu did not know about the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. He used archery to give the same idea, just right. The aiming of the arrow cannot be raised too high or too low. It has to be just right. The strength that you use in pulling back the bowstring cannot be too much or too little. It has to be just right. That is the connection between Goldilocks and Lao Tzu. It turns out that in various disciplines, science, psychology, etc., the Goldilocks principle shows up, the Goldilocks effect shows up. It's all over the place. It applies to human beings in terms of infants, babies, cognitive science. Experiments, observations show in developmental psychology, babies prefer learning from things that are not too simple or too complex. If it's too simple, something that the baby has already mastered, then the baby will quickly lose interest and look elsewhere. If it's too complex, then the baby, the infants will be confused, will be puzzled, and again, look elsewhere. At every level, every stage of development, the infant is looking for the Goldilocks effect, something that is just right for that stage of learning. So this is proven time and time again. And also applying to human beings, communication. This is because it turns out human beings consume information that is not too long, too detailed, and also not too short or too simplified. Basically, we all want information that does not require too much effort to understand, but can also teach us something new. There's a best-selling author whose nonfiction books have topped the bestseller lists repeatedly. He writes at the 8th grade level, not too difficult to comprehend, and yet he conveys such insights that his books become extremely popular. That's the Goldilocks effect in communication at work. In terms of human society, so this is not about individual human beings anymore, but about all of us together as a collective, as a society, about our world in general. So it turns out that in economics, the best possible scenario for growth of the economy is when commodity pricing is between bear market and bull market. That means the bear market is when the prices are plunging, bull market going up. When it is in that Goldilocks effect, when it's within the two, people are able to make a living, make a good living, while they are also at the same time incentivized to save and spend, causing the economy to grow. Lastly, as it applies to the world in general, not just individual human beings, and even the universe itself, there's the Goldilocks principle or the effect in astrobiology. How so? What is the graph that I show at the bottom right-hand corner there? The habitable zone that you see there is also called the Goldilocks zone. The Earth is within the Goldilocks zone just right. Not too hot, not too cold. If the planetary distance when the sun is too close, like Mercury, it's not fit for life to develop. If it's too far, like Jupiter and beyond, it's way too cold for life to develop. So the temperature limit has to be within reasonable constraints for liquid water. Now, ancient sages would oftentimes say, we live in the Tao. Ancient sages will say that the Tao is what provides us with what we need to live: sunlight, warmth, water, sustenance. And now we can link up what we say in the Tao and what the scientists are telling us about the way the universe works. There are many, many planets within this Goldilocks zone that is just right for life. And that's one of the reasons to believe that life is prevalent in the universe. We just haven't been able to see many examples other than our own. Down there, we can see that numerous aspects of our lives are governed in this way: the economy, our communication with one another, the development of babies, and so on. Well, the Earth exists in the Goldilocks zone. So that's another way to link up the concepts. It's a unified whole. Everything is connected. All are one. And lastly, we need to talk about applying the Tao. So this is about just right, or moderating from the extremes. Not too much, not too little. This leads to the balanced and harmonious life. And I want to use a variation of the yin and yang symbol to talk about that. The symbol itself, I want to caution everyone to be careful and not think about balance as a 50-50 split. It's not necessarily right down the middle. A compromise is not half this way, half that way, not always. The balance that we're talking about in the Tao is a proportion that is just right. So the idea of just right applies in a subtle way. When, as an example, we're lifting something heavy as a group, multiple people are helping out, it isn't that two people lifting a heavy object are contributing evenly, but that each person is doing what he or she can. If you have a child that is helping you lift something to move it within the house, well, the stronger adult will bear more of the weight, while the child will just be helping with what the child can do. From each according to ability to each according to need. So it has to be just right. The share is not necessarily an even split, but just the right amount. That's one subtle way to apply moderation to moderation. And this goes on as well. Question: should we be absolute in practicing this concept? Well, this is where I want to bring in the real yin and yang symbol that is showing yin within yang and yang within yin. And that is because for Tao cultivators, it is all about living the peaceful and quiet life. But is it always going to be peaceful and quiet? Is it absolute? Well, there's variety to spice things up. That's the small dot. Within the quiet life, one can enjoy the occasional celebration. Within the peaceful life, one can enjoy the occasional excitement. So we're moderate even when living in moderation. The spice of life, variety is the spice of life, but just like actual spice, you would not want to make an entire meal out of only spice. Having a meal that is entirely spicy pepper would be something that would not be palatable, would not be very good, would not be very nourishing. So once in a while, we can all use a break from the routine. We know too much excitement will tire you out, which is why it's a dot and not the whole thing. The amount of thrills, noise, celebration, excitement has to be just right in terms of proportion, once in a while. And this can vary from one person to the next. That variation is the next subtle point, the next and final subtle point, and that is the Tao is dynamic in action. This action, this application of this principle depends on the situation. And I mentioned that it's different from one person to another, and it can change all the time, dependent on the situation. The best way that I can explain that is to say, when we go back to the example of archery from the very beginning of this chapter, I would ask the question, how high should you elevate the angle? Is there a set angle that is the best angle? Well, there isn't. The raising of the bow and arrow depends on the target you're trying to hit. How far away is it? If it's very far away, I'm going to raise it up higher so I can describe a higher arc as the arrow flies to it. If it's close, I don't need to elevate the angle quite as much. So that's why. Now you see the reason, you see the genius. Lao Tzu uses archery, not the yin and yang symbol, as the ultimate example for this concept. Lastly, we just want to summarize everything by talking about how throughout history, there were many people that failed to follow the Tao, even those who study the Tao and who say they walk the path. They start off humble, but then they end up arrogant due to their achievements. So the final point from Lao Tzu is to apply this to life. The Tao of heaven is what people want to emulate, but then they end up with Tao of people so that they end up with excessive accomplishments that lead to internal insufficiency. Insufficiency in terms of humility. Then they fail and suffer as a result. That is why we must ultimately return to the Tao of the sages. We too have to reduce our excess externally and bring about equilibrium internally, regardless of how we accomplish and achieve in life. There is always room for humility in our hearts. And this is why I say we start from the Tao of heaven, we transition to understanding the Tao of people, which means we understand the need to follow the Tao of sages. So this is the ultimate point that this chapter is trying to convey. That is why we have the three sections, we have the progression from heaven to people to the sages. This concludes our discussion of chapter 77. Now, what I would like to do is to take everyone through the paraphrase of Tao Te Ching, chapter 77. As I mentioned, we started out with the Tao of heaven, and that is in the first section. It talks about the comparison with archery, the elevation, the lowering, the adding of strength, the reduction in strength. What would be a way to paraphrase that? Let me offer this. The Tao of nature is all about the right balance. This is reflected everywhere, even the art of archery. When you are about to fire an arrow, you have to aim by adjusting the angle, not too high and not too low. You also have to moderate your strength in pulling back the bowstring, not too much and not too little. You will hit the target if everything is just right. Then we go on to the second section, and you can see that it's about the Tao of heaven. Then it will be compared to the Tao of people. So here is the paraphrase to describe the principle embodied in the Tao of heaven. From this, we can see that the Tao in nature is constantly reducing the excessive and adding to the insufficient. Everything is adjusted toward equilibrium. So how about the Tao of people? In the next subsection, it talks about the Tao of people being contrary. Here's a paraphrase for that. People often act in contradiction to this principle. they often take from the poor to give to the rich. So those who have little end up with even less, while those who have too much get more and more. So I believe that depicts this section with modern language, leaving the last section, the conclusion. This is about the Tao of the sages. And here's the paraphrase I would like to offer. Who can be different and give what they no longer need to those who need it? Only the few who know the Tao. They are the sages who act in accordance with nature. They give naturally without the need to satisfy their ego. They are truly wise and so have no need to display their wisdom. That is the paraphrase for this chapter, and that brings us to the final slide for the entire thing, which is the full circle. In the last line of 77, we see that Lao Tzu says the sages do not wish to display their virtue. We link this back to the beginning, and we see the comparison between the Tao of Heaven and archery. So the meaning is quite clear. The sages apply the concept of balance and moderation as a virtue in life, using the bow and arrow as a mental imagery. They do so without using this concept as a way to showcase themselves, not as a way to talk about how virtuous they are. And this is something that we can put into practice in our own lives as well. We are truly fortunate in that the bow and arrow are the analogy to make the principle easy to understand, easy to remember, and put into practice. So keep this in mind. The Tao of Heaven is like drawing a bow. This brings us to the final slide, the conclusion of 77. And now we can go to the summary for today. Previously, we looked at part 1, summary of the first part. It's about getting the right angle and using the right amount of force. The purpose is to hit your target in life. The right angle, we talked about not too high, not too low, which meant you have to be realistic in your expectations, but you also don't want to sell yourself short. And we want to learn from experience to like the archer, to perfect your aim. An archer, an expert archer, is someone who has practiced shooting the arrow at a target thousands of times to perfect that aim. So experience is what allows us to perfect our aim as well. Same thing with the application of force, not too much, not too little. If we try to do something, if we're trying too hard, we trip over ourselves. If we don't go at it, if we don't dedicate ourselves to the effort, we may regret it later on, not doing more. So we have to do just the right amount. And we have to find the perfect balance, like the archer practicing at the shooting range. So that's Tao cultivation in that context. Lastly, here's the final summary slide. We want to talk about following the Tao of Heaven instead of following the Tao of people. The Tao of people is what most people do. The Tao of Heaven is the opposite. So we want to reduce the excessive like the Tao of Heaven, and it's okay for us to acquire, to build the resources that we possess. But when we have more than enough, it's time to simplify. And a great way to simplify is by letting go of things we don't actually need and share with those who don't have enough. And that's number 2, add to the liking, give to those who are less fortunate. contribute to worthwhile causes, and to do so with the detachment of the Tao. So remember, the Tao of giving is to give without expectations, without strings attached, and without damaging your ability to continue giving. Be the small stream that continues to flow. The small stream is the thing that is most congruent with the Tao. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.